Cameraman John Lane and I were just discussing what to film next when our Sherpa shouted for us to take cover. But John Lane and soundman John Soldini coolly switched on the camera before ducking, in the hope it might record something of whatever was coming down the mountain at us. The expedition gets underway from Pokhara as 120 porters take up their loads. 200 more porters will follow them when the main expedition gear arrives. At the moment, it's delayed at sea. The supplies these porters are carrying will only be enough for Chris Bonington and his climbers for the next 3 weeks. Each day's stage is about 10 miles, with one main stop for breakfast and lunch combined. On the first day, besides food, there was local entertainment. For the climbers, the approach march is merely a limbering up for the real work on the mountain. They can sit back and enjoy the local colour. For the porters, the approach march is 6 or 7 days of toil. But there's no other way to move supplies around these steep hills leading up to the high Himalayas. So for them, it's routine. At 10 shillings per day, it means over £3 in all in their pockets for carrying loads up to a height not far short of the tallest mountain in Europe. The porters are all Gurkha Hill tribesmen, and this area is the main recruiting ground for the British Army. Some of the porters come from the village at the top of the hill, Gandrung. Gandrung has sent more of its men to the British Army than any other village in Nepal. It's easy to see why Gurkhas make such good soldiers. Even the British Army must seem cushy after this hard life. The porters' leaders, ex-Lieutenant Kagbir Pun and ex-Sergeant Cheese Bahadur, have a good British Army parade ground manner and keep the porters happy and moving. Bringing up the rear is the fresh meat for the expedition. 2 goats that will be slaughtered later on the mountain. After 4 days, we reach the village of Chomrong, over halfway to Annapurna now. A pleasant campsite, and the weather still warm enough to sit out and catch up on a job or two. From here, the going will get tougher. Already, Chris Bonington, the expedition leader, has a couple of problems.
Well, I suppose a combination of the fact that our gear's been delayed at Bombay through the ship breaking down, and also the very, very bad winter snow, which apparently is one of the worst in living memory, which means that we're going to hit snow very low down. This is going to force us to have a base camp extremely low down, much lower than we'd have liked, and it's going to take time as a result, ferrying loads up through the snow to immediately below the face.
Are you going to be able to get the porters who are carrying the essential gear up through the snow?
We hope to be able to get, we're actually going to hit the snow just above a place called Hinko, which we're going to reach the day after tomorrow. And we're going to get all the porters up to a place which we call the Machapachari Base Camp, which is basically at the foot of the glacier, which we've got to walk up to approach the face. And this is just 1 short day. Now, most of these porters have got footwear of some kind. For those that haven't, and also as a little bait for those that have, we've got 150 pairs of gym shoes and 150 pairs of spectacles, which were produced rather like...
Sunglasses, really.
And we'll produce them rather like a conjurer, you know, just when they're beginning to falter.
This camp at the end of the 4th day at Chomrong marks the end of the first phase of the approach march to Annapurna. Up to now, we've been going up on ridges and then losing ground the next day, so it seems that one's never actually getting any higher. But from Chomrong village on, the last village on the route to Annapurna, we will be climbing all the time. The main problems now are the problems of the rest of the gear arriving in time to catch up this party of climbers, and the level of the snow higher up on the mountain, which could delay the beginning of the attempt on the face. One climber's already on the mountain, and the message we received from him was that he's convinced there's a Yeti or an abominable snowman up there. The abominable snowman is regularly sighted, as often, in fact, as the Loch Ness Monster. However, that's another story. John Edwards, Chomrong Village, Nepal, on the route to Annapurna. 4 News at 10. This is journey's end as far as the approach march goes. The Annapurna Expedition Base Camp, over 12,000 feet high, amid the snow, the rain and the clouds of the Himalayas. We did intend to push on further up the mountain, but the heavy snow has prevented us, so even from this base camp we can't see the South Face. But apart from the heavy snow, everything else has gone well, and even the porters who usually jib at such conditions have brought their heavy loads up through the ice and snow here to over 12,000 feet. The weather was colder and damper as the approach march ended and the porters got above 10,000 feet. It got a bit harder for them to leave the campfires and set off on the morning stage. But the climbers, once the peaks were in sight, were itching to get at them and film them. Dougal Haston never seemed to have his mind on the approach march at all, always on the mountains above. Nick Escort and Mick Burke in the glasses were also early starters. The first foreign explorers here a few years ago dubbed this area the Sanctuary of the Gods, for the route is surrounded on 3 sides by some of the highest mountains in the Himalayas. Just beyond the forest was the first snow, melting slowly but still deep for the time of year. This is where porters' strikes usually start. But our porters agreed to carry on in the snow provided they were given plimsolls and sunglasses, a reasonable enough request, though not all of them bothered to wear them. After 6.5 days humping their loads up and down 70 miles of mountains, the line finally came into our base camp at just over 12,000 feet. I was travelling light, but I could feel already the air getting a little thinner, breathing a little more laboured. The only effects the porters felt were relief at dumping their loads for the last time and the thought of the £3 10 shillings for their week's work. The porters may have come up slowly, but they were off in a flash, and joyfully. Base camp itself was soon up, looking rather small and forlorn in the shadow of the mountains. Already at base camp was Don Whillans, the deputy leader of the expedition, back from the first recce of the south face of Annapurna.
I went up there about 4 or 5 days ago, and it was a very clear day, and I had a pair of binoculars, and I studied the face for about 4 hours, I suppose. I saw one avalanche that came on a route that we were contemplating as an alternative line, which kind of put us off that altogether, and we've come back onto the original line that we thought would be the best.
I think that all the climbers have only seen the face on a photograph before. How did it compare when you saw it with the photograph?
Well, the first impression was that the face is quite a lot steeper than the photograph tells us. But after I'd watched it for 4 hours, it seemed to fall back a bit.
Just briefly, what chances do you give of success on the face?
I think we've a very, very good chance of climbing it now. And you have to stick your neck out a bit, but unless we have bad weather, for long periods, I think we'll do it. But if we have bad weather, of course, that's an entirely different kettle of fish.
One of the surprising things about the Himalayas, especially to the non-mountaineer, is simply how little is known about them. So vast and remote are they. In fact, it wasn't until 14 years ago that the first foreigner even got to this base camp area, and no one has actually been on the south face of Annapurna itself. So until the first two climbers of the expedition get onto the face, the climb is shrouded in a certain mystery. This is John Edwards for News at 10, Annapurna Expedition Base Camp.
Going on a mountaineering expedition is rather like signing on for one of those holiday tours advertised in glossy brochures by travel agents. In our case, the mountain organisers told us what beautiful views of the mountain we'd get when we arrived at base camp. Rather like the travel agents say in the holiday brochures that you'll see the Mediterranean from your hotel balcony. But there's usually a snag. And in our case, it's that our base camp is 6 snowy miles away from the south face of Annapurna itself. Not 3 miles, as originally planned. This is because the snow is so heavy at this time of year, unusually heavy, that we can't get all the equipment for our base camp further up the mountain. So just to film the south face of Annapurna requires an hour's hard, sometimes breathless climb in the snow at 13,000 feet. At the top of the ridge you can see only part of the south face of Annapurna, a massive, unlovely mountain, but vastly impressive in its strength and size, sheer rock and ice soaring 5 miles high. Because up to now the expedition has only had one photograph to plan its route from, Nick Escort, one of the climbers, has been surveying the face from the ridge to work out distances on the tough parts of the climb. Down below our ridge, the rest of the climbers were setting out from base camp, carrying food and equipment to the climbers farther up the mountain. This tiring slog would normally have been carried out by the porters used on our approach march, but they won't go this high when the deep snow is still around. A climb is like a military operation. The expedition is laying siege to a fortress-like mountain, gradually building up supplies to capture its summit. Already the load carrying has taken its toll in minor illnesses among the climbers, like altitude sickness and chest complaints. But if the supplies don't keep moving, the climb proper can't get underway. The first two climbers, Don Whillans and Dougal Haston, have now started up the foot of the face. And first reports are that they're finding it heavy going through snow and ice. And that's before they get to the hard climbing of the first ridge. Even at this stage, Himalayan mountains don't yield themselves up easily. John Edwards for News at 10, Annapurna Expedition Base Camp.
Any big mountain climb requires a delicate balance between how fast you get your climbers up the mountain and how fast you can keep supplying them to keep them going. Well, that delicate balance has been in danger on this expedition in the past few days. One of the problems has been that this base camp, set up 10 days ago, is 6 miles away from the south face itself. The porters couldn't take the base camp any further up the mountain because of heavy snow. The plan was for the porters to go away, wait a bit for the snow to melt, then, with all the supplies, come back later and move the base camp further up the mountain. This has meant that on the mountain itself, only half of the climbers, 5 of them, have managed to start the climb. To get the climb off to a fast start, Chris Bonington chose the 2 hard men of the team. The silent Scot, Dougal Haston, now a climbing instructor in Switzerland, and deputy leader Don Whillans, the plumber from Lancashire who's already been on 3 Himalayan expeditions. Haston always seems restless lower down, only really content when on difficult mountains.
He was first up the Eiger direct route after his partner had been killed on the way. Whillans is the tactician of the team, approaching rock and ice with the same craftsmanship and common sense he brought to plumbing. The two of them, aided by Bonington, have raced up to 20,000 feet in the past 10 days, as if they had decided to reach the summit before all the climbers had even started on the face. But the 6,545 feet left is the hardest part of all, with the added problems of altitude sapping strength. The climber's biggest danger so far was at the foot of the face, on the glacier. Here the climbers have to pass under dangerous seracs, overhanging ice, which could melt and fall at any moment. The climbers have already dubbed this part of the route Death Alley. Although you can't run at this height, you need to be quick with all that ice menacing above. Whillans didn't even have the benefit of a hard helmet when he went through. Climbing usually has to stop early afternoon in these parts. After the sun of the mornings come the snowstorms of the afternoon. The only thing to do then is to climb into a tent and keep warm. But while Whillans and Haston were forging ahead, down below at base camp, a storm was brewing up, in a snowstorm. 200 porters suddenly arrived with the main gear of the expedition, which had come by sea. They were expecting extra pay and accommodation in caves overnight for coming through the snow. Due to a misunderstanding, though, they arrived a day early. There was little accommodation ready, and some of them were already suffering from mild exposure. Base camp manager Kelvin Kent wanted to pay the porters off and send them down the mountain below the snow line, where it would be warmer. The porters refused to move, though bitterly cold, and also began to argue about their pay. There were also threats that they would not move further up the mountain with their loads to supply the climbers on the face. It was a cold, tense evening. But next day, the rates of pay were agreed. The weather was fine, and the feel of the rupees in their hands made some of the porters decide to go on and shift base camp further up the mountain. The first real crisis of the expedition was over, and 50 porters set off up to 14,000 feet with the vital supplies. Their rate, just over £1 for each day's work.
If the porters had decided not to go further up the mountain, we would have had no expedition. The porters are as vital as that. For 10 climbers simply could not carry this base camp and the expedition supplies for 2 months any further up. And it takes over 100 porters to do that over a number of days. Then, no supplies would have gone up the mountain, the climb would have come to a halt. As it is, happily, it's another hurdle overcome on the way to the summit. This is John Edwards, Annapurna Base Camp, for News at 10.
This dump was left in the snow when 40 porters moving up to base camp ran into a blizzard. They were told to pile it up and get back to shelter. Within hours, the animals that lived between 13 and 14,000 feet up had discovered their remarkable windfall and got to work. Sharp teeth tore open a package of food. They weren't sharp enough to cope with the tins, but they had a high old time with the nuts and raisins and boiled sweets. Who were these raiders? Mountain goats, possibly? The Sherpas say it was probably the stone marten, a weasel-like creature who lives in these high regions. Another strong suspect is the big black raven, who's been hanging hopefully around the expedition since we arrived. Whoever they were, they didn't have much luck. A lot of hard nibbling or pecking brought to light nothing more edible than a selection of paperbacks to suit all climbers' tastes. And judging from the tracks, it was the unfortunate raven who misguidedly concentrated his attention on one of our packages of film. He had enough determination to get a couple of 50-foot cassettes of silent film free from all their wrappings, but film, whatever its other virtues, can't be eaten.
The reason why the Himalayas remains the greatest test for any climber is simply because big mountains are unpredictable. Modern techniques, modern equipment would seem to give today's climber the edge over the mountain. Yet the mountains have a way of taking their revenge. Last year here, for example, no expedition reached the top of a major peak. This climb on the south face of Annapurna has been going for a month now. In the first 2 weeks, the lead climbers raced up to 20,000 feet, halfway up the face. But then came the problems. They hit a feature called the ice ridge. And for the past 2 weeks, they've been trying to find a way up that ridge. Sometimes they've been making as little progress as 30 yards a day. Also, altitude sickness is now affecting the leading climbers too. So the south face of Annapurna is putting up a hard fight. Chris Bonington, the expedition leader, has just come down from the face after 4 days hard climbing.
The route we've chosen, the first 500 feet above the col where we've got Camp 3, is comparatively easy. It's just plodding. And then we come to where we fix the ropes up on this steep arête. Now, the moment you've fixed a rope, it's comparatively easy. So the first day we've made 250 feet and you've got your rope fixed. And it might have taken us 3 hours to do that 250 feet in the first instance. But then when we come back to it, it'll only take us about half an hour to climb up these ropes.
Because it's a sort of handrail, the rope.
Well, you're
really.
actually climbing up the ropes with a special thing called a Jumar clamp, which slides up the rope, and it works on a ratchet principle and holds onto the rope when you put your weight on it. And you've cut your steps, and though it snowed the previous night, and the steps are covered in snow, all you've got to do is just scoop out the holes that you've made with your ice axe.
So you're making a sort of staircase in the ice?
You're making a staircase in the ice right up the thing. And then you reach your high point, you've got your ropes in place, and you start climbing. Now the trouble is it's taken you about 2.5 to 3 hours to reach the previous day's high point. And then you actually start climbing the new bit. Now at 20,000 feet, once again, your functions are that much slower. When you get high standard technical climbing, which we're now facing, it takes that much longer than if you'd been actually climbing at sea level.
This story should, I suppose, be called A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Icefall. For as a story, it's something of a disappointment. The icefall is a row of crumbling ice cliffs, 1,000 feet up there, about 2 hours climb away. And it's the first hazard that the climbers encounter on their route up the south face. Of course, every mountain has its dangers, but the sheer size of the Himalayas make the dangers all that much greater. Perhaps the greatest dangers of all are those the climbers can do nothing about. The mountain's natural weapons, snowstorms, avalanches, ice falls. It was to film this type of danger that the ITN crew and myself went up to the icefall yesterday. For safety, we were all roped up on our journey through the icefall. Alan Hankinson of ITN was the first man on the rope. Then came myself, then soundman John Soldini, and last of all our young Sherpa, who, though he's lived all his life on the slopes of Everest, had, unfortunately, never been through an icefall before. Our plan was to set up the camera at the end of the icefall and watch the climbers and porters come through it. But first, we had to get through it ourselves. I, for one, began to wish I'd started my climbing career on little rocks in Wales and the Lake District, rather than at 15,000 feet up on a 26,000-foot mountain. I'm afraid the party's rope technique left a lot to be desired, in spite of some elementary hints from Alan Hankinson, the only one of us with climbing experience. In places, the real climbers had placed fixed ropes as a sort of handrail for getting along difficult sections. In other places, little crevasses had opened up in the ice, since the whole icefall is slowly melting and shifting down the mountain as the weather gets hotter in the months of April and May. The icefall seems fairly solid, but there's always something breaking away, however small. Our Sherpa was the nearest to this piece of rock. But we got good warning of bigger ones that followed. We then climbed the slope to fix up the camera to film the porters that were following us. They soon came, walking as fast as possible through the last part of the icefall,
which looks like a meringue that has got out of control. Leading the porters was the head Sherpa, Haston, who had the good sense to wear a red crash helmet. Only a few days ago, 5 of his Sherpa friends were killed in the much bigger and more dangerous Everest icefall, working for a Japanese expedition. The porters went through safely, and cameraman John Lane and I were just discussing what to film next when our Sherpa shouted for us to take cover. I ran to the nearest rock, but John Lane and soundman John Soldini coolly switched on the camera before ducking, in the hope it might record something of whatever was coming down the mountain at us.
Here, we still don't know if the camera recorded anything, but we do know what came down at us from the mountain. Lumps of ice, some of them as big as footballs. While we were under the rocks, the ice smashed into the camera and the tripod, snapped off the lens, and sent it hurtling down the mountainside. We were safe, but the camera wasn't, and we couldn't film any more. So, as I said in the beginning, the story's something of a disappointment. We went up to film the ice fall and what it might do to the climbers, and we found out what it might do to camera crews and their cameras. Oh well, that's show business. John Edwards for News at 10 with the Annapurna South Face expedition.
At base camp at 14,000 feet, Dougal, Haston and Don Whillans relax after a grueling week as the lead climbers on Annapurna. Now they can enjoy watching at long range the other climbers, 3 miles away, 7,000 feet higher up, battling slowly up the snow and ice. Only yesterday, both of them were up on the face itself, fighting to clear a route up the ice ridge, a steep, long slope of rotten snow and ice, which had threatened to halt the progress of the climb for the past 2 weeks. Heavy new snow slowed up Haston's and Whillans' efforts. And then, with the sun, came the avalanches. Whillans, as safe and canny a climber as any in the world, wisely steered clear of possible avalanche routes. Some days they would make only 50 yards progress, not knowing if the route they had chosen would lead them on to the ice ridge. But finally they came out on top of the ice ridge and reached the site for Camp 4, as the avalanches continued to roll past them. Lower down, the climbers ferrying up the vital supplies from Camp 2 to Whillans and Haston at Camp 3 also had avalanche problems. The climb up to Camp 3, which is just over 20,000 feet, has been taking its toll of the climbers, especially those who have never been to the Himalayas before. Mike Thompson had to give up twice on this carry because of altitude sickness. Later, he had to go down to base camp to recuperate. The carry from Camp 2 to Camp 3 is crucial to the expedition, since Camp 3 is halfway up the face, and from now on will become the supply depot for the last half of the climb. But the route from 2 to 3 is prone to avalanches, and if there is more snow, the carry would have to stop, and the climbers out in front would be halted for lack of supplies. Any such delay could ruin the expedition's chances of climbing the South Face, since the monsoon and its bad weather are only 5 weeks away. The climbers will then be forced off the face whether they have climbed it or not.
So the expedition is over halfway up the south face of Annapurna now. With the ice ridge overcome, there's a feeling of real optimism. But everyone recognises that the biggest problem is still ahead.
the rock band, nearly half a mile of it soaring up to 24,000 feet, where the rock could be soft, the climbing will be hard, and the air will be cold and thin. It should prove a challenging climax to the expedition. This is John Edwards, 4 News at 10, at the Annapurna Expedition Base Camp. The fight to climb the south face of Annapurna is now turning into a cliffhanger, if the climbers hanging up there on the real cliffs will pardon the expression. The expedition now has 3 weeks before the weather breaks and the monsoon makes all climbing impossible. But there's still 1 mile of the face still left to climb, and the climbers' progress in recent days has been measured in feet per day rather than yards, so it's a race against time. The big hold-up has been the ice ridge. As I reported earlier, Don Whillans and Dougal Haston broke the back of the ridge and set up Camp 4 near the top of it. But since then, the next pair of lead climbers, Nick Escord and Martin Boyson, have got bogged down again at the top of the ridge. They were glad to get back to base camp for a rest after 4 days out in front. What sort of climbing has it been up there?
Well, the first 2 days or so were almost entirely snow or ice climbing. This is above Camp 4. Up at this ridge consisting of very ornate mushroom-shaped cornices of snow. It's a formation caused by the wind, which you don't get except in the Himalayas and Andes. The hardest part of it was very, very steep, very soft, mushy sort of snow with ice underneath, very nearly vertical in several sections.
Is this harder than anything you've done in the Alps? Because you've both done a lot of climbing in the Alps. Is it harder climbing?
Well, certainly harder ice climbing than I've done in the Alps. I would compare it to hard ice climbing I've done in Scotland in winter, which is of a very high standard.
Do you think that this type of climbing is the hardest at that altitude that people have done on a Himalayan mountain?
Well, I should think it's unlikely anything very much harder has been done. I can't really imagine anything very much harder actually, having to be done on the sort of Himalayan type of climb.
What sort of day do you have up there? Just give me a rundown of how the day goes.
It's usually about 2 hours between waking up and actually setting off, and then you climb up the fixed ropes that you've left the previous day, try and climb a few more 100 feet and fixed ropes on that. Slide back down the ropes, get back. We were getting back about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, which is quite a long day.
Over 7 hours then.
Yeah. I mean, really about 5 hours is the most that you can go for at that sort of altitude. And then there's about 3 hours while you try to cook some supper and sort of radio call and all that kind of thing, and then eventually sort of go to, well, you're already in bed, but you eventually try and go to sleep at about 7, I suppose. So you're trying to sleep for very nearly 12 hours.
How did you feel at the end of 3 days of doing sort of 7 hours climbing up this very difficult ice ridge?
Well, very, very tired. The worst part of it was that every day you had to go back over the ground, which you've done already, which involves climbing up fixed ropes over overhanging mushrooms of ice, and the thought of having to go through it all over again to get onto the new ground really puts you off.
Can you say you enjoyed up there?
Very difficult question. Parts of it, yes. As Nick says, a magnificent situation. The whole of the basin below you, and it's incredible.
Yeah.
And also the climbing is quite enjoyable. If it wasn't so tiring,
and if it wasn't so frustrating that you're wanting to make as much progress as possible to push right up the mountain, but in fact you're just making 100 foot a day or so, which just seems absolutely pathetic.
Is this more difficult climbing than you'd expected? I mean, you looked at the photographs, you'd seen what the face was like. Is it more difficult than you'd expected?
Well, one always hoped that it wouldn't be as difficult as this, but in fact it was to be expected. That the ice ridge would be. There would be parts of it which would be very difficult.
Now that the rock band's been reached, eyes are naturally turning towards the summit, only 3,500 feet away. It doesn't seem very far, but no one underestimates the 2,000 feet of the rock band still to be climbed. And everyone remembers that the biggest obstacle so far to the climb, the ice ridge, was only 1,000 feet high, yet took 21 days to climb. That's an average of 50 feet per day. The trouble was that to get that 1,000 feet climbed, the climbers had to climb about 3,000 feet to find the best route up. But there's no doubt that the expedition siege of Annapurna is really tightening up now. There's about 2 miles of rope now spread out along the face, and there'll be another mile of rope before the expedition's over. And yet, big mountains have a way of striking back unexpectedly. Chris Bonington, the expedition leader, wanted to throw all his climbers into the attack on this last phase of the climb. To speed up progress, he ordered that no one should come below 20,000 feet, because too much time was being wasted with climbers coming down here to base camp to rest, and then having to spend days going up the mountain again. But mountains are no respecters of expedition leaders or their plans, and Bonington found that it was impossible for climbers to really rest in the thin air at 20,000 feet.
Our climbers are widely scattered between these camps, and if we brought them back down to base camp for a rest each time, it meant that we lost a pair of climbers for very nearly a week by the time they come down to base camp and then work their way up the mountain. Well, I experimented and tried resting for 2 days at 20,000 feet at Camp 3, which would cut out this 3 or 4 day time lapse, and I found it just didn't work the hard way, because I spent 2 days at Camp 3. I was fairly extended and tired when I came down because I'd been 6 days out in front, and yesterday I tried to go back up again to join in with the climbers, and I got halfway up to Camp 4 and I was just totally shattered and was useless. And this is what we're going to have to do now. We are going to have to pull climbers back as they're rested. The trouble is that you've got the mental stress of high standard climbing, and it is very high standard, very steep climbing. It's also on the ridge particularly, it was physically tiring because there's great masses of unconstituted snow which have been softened by the heat of the sun, because it's the south face, clinging to the rock. And before you could make any progress at all, you had to clear the snow with your ice axe, just sweeping it away. In fact, we finally, or Don finally discovered the ideal weapon for this was an old XWD entrenching tool.
Like a shovel.
And like a shovel, you just shovel it away. And this is very tiring indeed. And then you've got onto the rock. You're then doing quite difficult rock climbing. You're having to place pitons as well, which is hammering them in, and this once again is tiring. This is very different from the traditional Himalayan plod, because when if you're just plodding up, I mean, you're just using your leg muscles and your chest and nothing else, whereas here you're climbing very steep fixed ropes, and there's one point where you're actually climbing a rope that is hanging free over a cornice of snow, and you swing right out into space, and you've got these Jumar clamps, and you climb up the rope using these.
Do you think now you've got a race against time on your hands?
There's an element of race in it. We've got about 3 to 4 weeks to get the rest of the climb done. On the other hand, I think we've done by far the most complicated part of the climb in getting up the ice ridge. And I think the rock band should be simpler. And it's a matter of knowing in the next 3 or 4 days, when our lead party actually get right into the rock band, just how hard it's going to be. And you can't tell until you've actually rubbed your nose on it.
Captain Kelvin Kent of the Gurkha Signals sends the latest progress report on the expedition to the nearest town of Pokhara, 7 days' march away.
On 11/11 May, Mike Alpha Yankee, Chris Bonington, the leader, Lima Echo Alpha Delta Echo Romeo, was Whiskey Alpha Sierra, forced Foxtrot Oscar Romeo Charlie Echo Delta, to return to base camp with pleurisy.
Thank you very much.
What's the matter?
Well, I think I've got a touch of pleurisy.
Yeah.
Well, at least that's what Dave says anyway.
What you left yesterday and you got up to where?
Got up to Camp 2 today, but the pain in my chest was steadily getting worse. Even though I was making good times,
And I talked it over with Dave, and he listened to my chest, and he reckons it can't possibly be a muscular trouble. It must be pleurisy.
High up on the face, Bonington's men were also feeling the strain. The real problem at this stage of the climb, as the climb gets higher, is that usually 6 climbers are thinly strung out on the mountain in 5 camps. If one climber goes sick, it can vitally affect the supplies like rope and food going up to the climbers out in front. If more than one climber is sick, those vital supplies can come to a halt altogether. The climbers suffering most from fatigue at the moment are the load carriers, especially those carrying on the crippling run from Camp 4 to Camp 5 at 23,000 feet. On a normal mountain, the Sherpas would help the climbers carry these loads, and indeed go to the top, as Sherpa Tenzing did on Everest in 1953. But the south face of Annapurna is so sheer and difficult to climb that Sherpas can't go above 21,000 feet. So after that, the climbers are left to carry for themselves. When Bonington got on the radio to his higher camps, the tiredness of the climbers was only too apparent.
Hello, Mike at Camp 3. Come in, please. Over.
Loud, clear, Chris, over.
Mike, I'm afraid I'm not very much use at the moment. I've gone down with a dose of pleurisy and I'm going to be out of action for 3 or 4 days. How are you feeling yourself now? How are you going? Over.
Today I got up to Camp 4, all right, with a load. But I felt very weak, and much weaker than the last few times I've been up there. And I have a feeling that, to be being honest, being realistic, that if I went to 4, I suspect I wouldn't be able to manage to carry to 5, because I'm fairly run down, over.
Hello, Camp 4, come in please, over.
Oh, Chris, sorry to hear you're not going to make it for a few days. We're getting a bit sort of drawn out ourselves, over.
As the climbers get tired, has the expedition got enough drive left to reach the summit, only 3,000 feet away? Bonington talked about the chances now.
Chris, it seems that the team are getting very tired now. On the radio every night there are reports of people feeling in a very bad way. Do you think this is really going to hinder the chances of climbing the mountain?
It certainly won't hinder chances of climbing the mountain, I think, though of course it could delay it. Our problem is that even though when we set out we seem to be a very big expedition, in fact we're very nearly as large as the Everest expedition if you don't count Sherpas. We're bigger than the expedition to Kanchenjunga. And yet of course when we're stretched out on the mountain, we're now very thin indeed, particularly out in front. And we've got 4 people, Tom Frost and Mick Burke, actually making the route, and backed up by Martin and Nick, who've been out in front a long time and inevitably are getting tired. And the decision really that I've got to make now is one between trying to keep the momentum of the climb on somehow, even though people are getting tired, gaining ground each day, and we are gaining ground each day, or pulling everyone back for a rest, resting them, and right back to base camp, resting them, and then going up in a concerted push. The risk of this is always that the moment you pull people back, you go and get absolutely perfect weather, and then when you go onto the mountain, you could be losing the weather. And of course, we are short of time.
If the summit is reached, my money is on Don Whillans and Dougal Haston to make it. They've provided the steam for this climb all the way up.
Bloody socks are knackered. Bloody socks. Shake the scorpions out.
Whillans has been on 3 Himalayan expeditions before, but never reached the top on any occasion. He seems determined this time. Dougal Haston has never climbed in the Himalayas previously, but has been the star among the lead climbers. The hopes for the success of the expedition, I reckon, lie with Haston and Whillans now. Before the day's climbing starts, Bonington arranges walkie-talkie radio calls with the lead climbers, Mick Burke and the American Tom Frost. After the call, Frost starts on his way up towards the rock band. He's a climbing equipment manufacturer from California, and is one of the best rock climbers in the world. High on the rock band, Mick Burke begins on the first pitch. Tom Frost follows. Down below, the rope and food needed to keep Burke and Frost climbing are slowly moved up the mountain by the other climbers. Carrying loads on a difficult face like this has proved more tiring for the climbers than the lead climbing and route making. Down at base camp, Bonington calls up Tom Frost on the hour to check he's on the right route.
Roger, one problem that we are going to have is the actual amount of fixed rope we have got. I think we've got about 2,500 feet coming up to you, but on your present progress, what you've used 1,000 feet, and you're certainly only about a fifth, I should say, the way up the rock band. You really will have to conserve rope. Over.
Okay, thank you. We seem to do a lot of traversing and low angle work from time to time, so we'll keep this in mind as we go. Over.
Roger, great. By the way, can you actually see us down here? Over.
Roger, we sure can. Your orange tent stands out real well despite the distance. Over.
Great, okay. Well, I must say, I wish I was up there with you. Very well done, Tom. Great stuff out.
Thanks, Chris. There's times when I wish I was down there with you. Climbing party out.
By using the radio, the lead climbers avoid taking a wrong turn, which could cost them valuable time and energy. Time is all important for the expedition now, since the monsoon could break in 2 weeks and force the climbers off the mountain for good. Burke and Frost's push up the rock band in the past week has left them exhausted. Both have been on the mountain for a month with no rest at base camp. But their efforts have set the scene for the drive to the summit. Dougal, Haston and Don Whillans have now taken over the lead on the rock band from Burke and Frost, who've earned a well-deserved rest at base camp. Haston and Whillans seem as strong and as impatient as ever to be the first on top. Their summit bid could come any day now.
Look out!
It took us from 7 in the morning, leaving Camp 6, to 2:30 on the summit. Conditions were wild. There was a lot of wind. It was very cold, and the spindrift was blowing as usual. Roger so far, over.
Roger so far, over.
Otherwise, it was a fairly uneventful trip.
Roger, Dougal. What did you say to Don when you got to the summit, or what did he say to you, over?
Can't really remember. He was sitting there already fixing up the abseil to go back down again. And I'd been behind him, about 100 feet behind him all the way, taking some film. And didn't really say very much, over.
Did you say anything to each other at the time, or did Don light up his usual cigarette, over?
Well, Don had been out of cigarettes, as well as food for the last 4 or 5 days. So he couldn't light the customary cigarette, over.
How long have you been out of food up there, over?
Well, for the last week, except for the intermittent meal brought by Chris, we've been living on porridge, and a mixture of porridge and sugar.
Hello, Dougal, is Don there? I'd like to have a word with him, over.
Oh, yes, Jimmy, here he is, over. Hello, John, you reading me, over?
Yeah, loud and clear, Don. Congratulations. This is I think you've been to the Himalayas, 3 times before, and this is your first summit. How are you feeling tonight, over?
Well, it's nice to have put the finishing touch to a job. I don't think it was any harder than any of the others, but it was certainly colder, over.
Don, can you remember what you said to Dougal? He can't remember what he said to you at the top of Annapurna, over?
Yeah, I was in the lead today, and when Dougal was coming over with the rope, he was carrying the rope and the camera. When he stuck his head over, I was already knocking a piece on him to go down. He said something like, "Are you all right, lad?" And I said, "Aye."
OK, Don and Dougal, that's all from us. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow, and once again, many congratulations from Base Camp. Base Camp, over and out.
Hello, Camp 3, this is Base.
Well, as I was saying in my last story, you never can tell in the Himalayas. There we were this afternoon at Base Camp. The weather had closed in, it was snowing. We thought there'd be no movement at all on the mountain. But we came out at 5 o'clock of our tents, it was still snowing, for a routine radio call. And then suddenly, Camp 6, Dougal, Haston and Don Whillans, who have been in the lead this whole climb, said they'd got to the summit. It wasn't meant to be that way. They were meant to go up to establish Camp 7, the last camp, before then making a bid for the summit at the end of the week. But that's it. They've got to the summit, and as the news came through at Base Camp, the weather lifted, it stopped snowing, and suddenly the clouds went away from Annapurna, and as you can see now, the sun is just hitting the top of the summit where Dougal, Haston and Don Whillans have been today. 26,545 feet, and what some people had described as an impossible route has been conquered. We hope to bring you film of that summit when the 2 climbers, Dougal, Haston and Don Whillans, come down. But for the time being, this is a very happy John Edwards from Base Camp with the Annapurna South Face expedition. As they came to the end of the icefall, they looked tired but satisfied men. Their only problems, Dougal Haston was suffering from a touch of tonsillitis, and Don Whillans was dying for a cigarette and a drop of something stronger than climber's tea. Well done. Welcome back. Oh, there you are.
Beautiful.
Fear.
I'll turn it right off now.
Well, you better have a rest, huh? How was it, anyway?
Fantastically cold. Very hard to avoid frostbite, you know. And just windy with a bit of snow blowing about. We arrived at the tent that we'd dumped previously for Camp 7, just lying on the floor. We picked it up. There was no suitable site around. We carried it another 400 feet higher, I should think. And then it became very clear. It was patchy day, and we could see the summit. It was easier to go for the summit than it was to pitch the tent. I was in front, he was filming behind, and I reached the ridge. It was blowing a howling gale, and on the other side, on the north side, it was nice and sunny and no wind. I just sat there and waited for him to pop over the top, and walked onto the summit, which was just only a few yards away.
How do you feel anyway now? I mean, very tired?
I'm tired, yeah. Today coming down has been a long, long day. There's lots of gymnastics swinging around on horizontal traverse ropes, and then when we got down to Camp 4, the snow was waist deep, and I mean, it's been a bit of a fight to get down, and
But the days leading up to the summit, you mean literally living on porridge, were you?
well, I had 2 days on cigars and snow water. When he dropped the sack, he dropped his sack.
So, the south face of Annapurna, one of the most difficult climbs ever attempted in the Himalayas, has surrendered. And the Annapurna South Face expedition, the largest and costliest to leave England since the famous 1953 Everest expedition, has had its success. And by the look of the weather, Dougal, Haston and Don Whillans may just have made it in time.
Ian Clough's funeral took place on the day that the Annapurna expedition was leaving the mountain to start its journey home. But Ian Clough's last journey, on the shoulders of his fellow climbers and the expedition Sherpas, was to a hillside overlooking base camp. Clough, a climbing instructor in Scotland, was killed in an ice avalanche coming down the mountain when he was only 3 hours away from base camp and safety. He was one of the last men on the face, bringing down the climbing equipment that was left after the summit had been reached. Chris Bonington, the expedition leader, decided Clough should be buried at base camp because of the difficulty of getting the body to the nearest town 5 days' march away. Bonington, one of Clough's closest friends, paid a brief tribute to him at the graveside.
I should just like to say a very few words about Ian. He was a fine mountaineer and a very, very safe one. But most important of all, he was the kindest, he was the most unselfish, and I think the most universally liked person that I've ever known.
So what should have been a happy last day for the Annapurna expedition turned into a day of sadness. And Ian Clough was left behind on the mountain he had helped the expedition to climb so brilliantly.
A mountainside 14,000 feet up in the Himalayas may seem a lonely place, far away from his native Yorkshire or his home in Scotland. But as one of his expedition friends said, perhaps, after all, it's the most suitable burial place for a mountaineer.
I was gazing around the slope, and suddenly I saw a black object that was moving. See, when you're climbing, you get used to looking for people on snow, and if they move very slowly, you say, you note the position of all black dots. And this one definitely had moved. So I watched a bit longer, and then it moved fairly quickly towards a patch of trees. So I had a monocular in the tent, so I grabbed the monocular and started looking through. There was a bitter cold wind blowing. It was perishing cold. And I thought, well, I'll wait while it comes out of that blow of trees. And after about 10 minutes, it came out of the tree and started to go up the snow towards another patch. And it had the appearance of kind of lunging, you know, like I imagine.
Not like a goat or a deer or anything like that.
Nothing as sprightly as that. Something heavier. And I thought, well, is it a bear? You see, it had a kind of semi-bear.
Because that's what people say the Yetis are. The abominable snowmen are bears.
That's right. And I thought, well, is it a bear? And yet there was this funny atmosphere again that we'd had the day before. That you were looking at something that wasn't quite understood. Anyway, I had the monocular on it, and then it left the top patch of trees, and it came a diagonal traverse right across the snow, I should think for about, at least half a mile. And then the movements of the thing just struck me as a gorilla, you know, kind of the way you see them running about at the zoo.
Not like a bear at all?
No, you know, it tended more towards what I imagine a gorilla. Yeah. And it just simply went right across the snow and disappeared in the shadows of the moonlight into some rocks. And I had the feeling that I had been watching something a bit different.